Hello and welcome back to Advanced Conversation with Professor Kent Lee. The last part of the semester deals primarily with misconceptions. And being able to analyze misconceptions, call them out, criticize, critique them, understand why these things are wrong, and understand maybe why they are so popular, why people believe them. And we're going to deal with all kinds of misconceptions, starting with misconceptions today about gender. We kind of talked about advertising and some gender misconceptions last time, and we'll go into other issues all the way to conspiracy theories and why conspiracy theories are popular, what's wrong with them, and maybe the possible harm of these various kinds of misconceptions, and what we can do about them, perhaps. So regardless of what you're going to do with your English major or whatever major you're doing, or your career, your life, to be an informed citizen, you need to understand this stuff. To be an intelligent consumer of mass media and social media, where we see this stuff a lot, you need to understand what's going on and why this stuff is so popular now. Now, for the gender issues, we're going to talk about that today. Some of the stuff I know, some of the stuff I'm not really an expert on, so I'm going to be careful about the areas where I'm less knowledgeable. But I just want to have discussion. At least I want to throw some things out for you all to discuss with each other. And maybe some of these are topics you might like to look into on your own. And this could be a good topic for your final presentation. Well, it depends on whether we're still in class or we're still online. If we're in class or still online at the time, but I'm hoping to have you do either an individual presentation if we're still online, or maybe a little group presentation about kind of similar topics if we are able to return to live classes. We'll see how it goes, but I want to cover a number of different topics. So I did ask before for some suggestions on gender issues, and I didn't get any responses. And this is kind of hard to do just on video. It would be so much more interesting to do in-class discussion and some kind of on-the-spot activities and discussions in class, and we could do a lot more with this. But because this is just video, I'm going to have to make it shorter than what I had planned. So maybe one or two videos on this topic. Unless I can find something else, then we're going to move on to the next topic. Unless there's really an outcry, an outpouring from you all for more on this. So first we're going to talk about misconceptions about sex and gender in the first video segment, and then we're going to go on to discussing other issues, gender issues. So, let's get started. Let's talk about some key terms. Before we dive into this, let's talk about some definitions and some kind of basic things we need to understand in order to have intelligent discussion on these kinds of issues. First, let's talk about political correctness. What is political correctness? Do you know this term? This is a kind of a popular term in the West, like in my country. And in recent years, it's kind of gotten a bad name, a bad reputation. It's turned into something else than what it was. So when I was in college, political correctness was, you typically associate it with kind of the left, liberal views. It's not just that, though. The original political correctness that came along in the 90s and 80s and when I was in college was a good thing. Even if you weren't a liberal, it was still something you could accept, because political correctness back then was simply defined as tolerance and tolerant speech. That is not so much about attitudes and questions, but just not using terms that would be sexist or racist or offensive to certain groups, homophobic, that is anti-gay, So it was about watching your language and just being tolerant of different people. It didn't mean that you had to agree with them. It didn't mean that you had to accept all of their political ideas, or a certain set of political ideas, but it meant being respectful of different ideas that are different from your own, especially when it comes to issues of race and gender, discrimination, things like this. It meant having a tolerant attitude, a respectful attitude toward different groups of people, maybe people who are not like you, and not using language that would be offensive to different groups of people. So, being aware of sexist language and attitudes and behavior, or being aware of racist attitudes, language, and behavior. It still meant you could ask honest questions as long as it was not from like a racist or, sexist intention or agenda. You could ask honest questions about women, about African American people or black people, or such. And it wasn't about policing people's language and policing people's attitudes. But what this has become in recent years is something different. And I've been away from my country for quite a while, but apparently in the past, I guess while I was away, things have changed. And it has become more of a dogmatic kind of political correctness. It's morphed or changed into something else, something that is dogmatic, that is policing people's language and interpreting or misinterpreting little things as racist when it was not intended to be racist. Okay, here's an example. In American slang, we have the expression, something went south, something has gone south, meaning it has declined in quality. I always thought it was thinking of like, well, we have this kind of cultural divide in the U.S. between the North and the South is kind of more conservative and backwards. I always thought in those terms. But then people in the new political correctness movement would say, you shouldn't say that, that's racist, because going south refers to going down to Mexico, it's a racist term. Well, you know what, I looked it up in linguistic history, there's nothing racist about it. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, it just means a decline in quality. And if you study linguistics, you can understand this. Something just going down or south is like a metaphor for down, and so going south is a decline in quality. Has nothing to do with Mexico or there's nothing racist about it. It's really silly to say that that's racist. So it's a hypersensitivity, it's an extreme or excessive sensitivity to racism and sexism and homophobia and such. The intentions behind it are maybe understandable, but the approach is wrong, I think. It's what we call an authoritarian political correctness. It says you can't ask honest questions or have honest disagreements about issues of race. And I don't mean whether racism is acceptable. No, I just mean assuming we believe that racism is very bad and we need to fight it, what are some better ways to deal with racism? And just having honest disagreements about policies, or asking honest questions about about other cultures. Or one time an American teenager wore a Chinese dress and it was on SNS, and these authoritarian PC people raised a fuss about it. Well, she was wearing it. Apparently she had some familiarity with China and there was nothing racist about her doing it, and it was a kind of dress that was associated with kind of female empowerment or dignity, and it was about that. So for her it was maybe kind of a pro-female, even a feminist thing, and it was not an anti-cultural, or it was not about stealing Chinese culture or anything like that. So it's an authoritarian political correctness. So when it comes to college classes, sometimes it means shutting down debate or honest discussion. You have to agree with me. You have to agree with my left-wing policies about race and gender and such. And that's wrong. Political correctness should mean we can have honest discussion and sometimes disagreement about how to improve, gender equality, how to better understand each other. So I think the older political correctness was more associated with the kind of the progressive left, but even if you weren't liberal, it was still, you could go along with it and say, yeah, I should be careful and not say things that would be offensive to black people or to women. But the modern political correctness, the authoritarian political correctness, has become quite intolerant. And it's more associated with what we might call the regressive left. It's a dogmatic, far left kind of approach, and it's not one that I agree with. As a social scientist, I believe in the old traditional political correctness, but not the new kind of dogmatic political correctness. As a social scientist, I think we have to have honest discussions and sometimes open discussions. For example, 20 years ago, maybe I was ignorant about gay and lesbian issues, and probably had honest questions and differences of opinion with more liberal people. If I tried to ask honest questions back then, and if I just said, well, what if we do this instead of that, to bring about more fairness, or if I just said, well, back then I was more conservative, well, I said, well, I don't agree with it, but I think they have the right to do, well, I don't agree with it, I'm a bad person because I don't agree with it. If somebody had simply tried to shut me down, shut me up, and say, no, this is the way it has to be, you have to believe this, if you're not, you're an evil person. If I'd received that 20 years ago, I would have not really changed my attitudes. For me, it was honestly looking at the science and the psychology of issues like this, and learning the truth that changed my views over the years on issues like this. Simply shutting people down is not healthy to the cause. And I have to say, the far left, if they're doing this, they're just like the far right. So the far right is guilty of the same thing. They could object to discussing these kinds of topics in a college classroom, somebody from a far right background. That's wrong. College is about exposing yourself to new ideas and sometimes making yourself feel uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. You have to do that in college. College is about, adult life in general, is about being exposed to new ideas, critiquing your ways of thinking, your beliefs, examining whether they are correct, sometimes being made uncomfortable, sometimes having to ask difficult questions or answer difficult questions or think about difficult questions. It should make you uncomfortable. So intelligent discussion is not really for the dogmatic people on the right and the left, and both sides are guilty of dogmatism and trying to shut down discussion or trying to force their views onto other people. Both sides are guilty here. So these are the ground rules that I'm laying down for this kind of unit. Open and honest discussion, but fairness and respect for people who are different from you, and recognizing their rights, their equality, their status as human beings. Okay, so let's go on.